Ruler School is brought to you by Happy Little Hug Factory and these amazing patrons. Extra special thank you to guest lecturer patrons Brody Harris and Lance Albertson. Thank you for your support. Enjoy the video.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Tournament Report with yours truly, Paul Reissmann, and today we are going to be looking at the World Grand Prix tournament that just took place in Tokyo, Japan this past weekend. But before we even do that, I have to tell you that would really help the channel out if you went down and hit subscribe as well as hitting the bell. That way you get notified of whenever Ruler School's videos get posted, and then you can watch those videos and learn more about Force of Will. It's a win-win. But then of course you can also hit the like and the dislike button. If you really like this video, that'd be great. If you don't like this video, let us know. That would really help. And of course, to do that, you would have to comment down below. So definitely go down to the comment section down below. Let us know what you thought of the video, and let us know your thoughts, because this is a big tournament. All of this stuff is new. All of these cards are new. And why is that? Because this is a new Valhalla Cluster only. And so about 121 players got to play the new set of cards, the 5 new structure decks and the new Dawn Rises set that is coming out to complement that. They got to play these cards before any of us. So I guess that's what happens when you get to go to Worlds and you're of the 121-ish best players in the world. That's what you get to do. Get a good look at the new stuff coming out. So of course, like we do on every tournament report, we go down the ruler breakdown for this entire tournament. There were 34 Hanzo, 24 Loki, 23 Arthur, 22 Lucifer, 9 Brunhilde, 6 Isis, 3 Adam, 0 Chimimi, 0 Lich, and 0 Fushi. Now the reason I say that is because these are the only rulers that we are going to be getting from here on out. Of course, if you pick up the structure deck, you can use that ruler the whole season because you're going to get more and more support as the sets get released. But these are the only rulers you're going to see. And of course, when I put this into Google Sheets, they wouldn't let me put in the other rulers if they just had 0. So they're not on the list, but I just told you them, right? And it's also pretty accessible information, so check that out. So instead of doing what we normally do, which is going over the deck lists, explaining why the cards in them are good, explaining the card choices, the differences, that's all well and good if we're halfway through the season. But this is a new season, so we're going to talk about things a little bit differently. We're going to talk about the decks that were the most popular. And that by far, as you can see on this chunk of the pie graph, 2/3 of the tournament were all machines. Now, when you think machines, you probably are thinking Arthur. And Arthur's pretty good. Divinity 10, Judgment for 3 blue, Energize, pretty good. Flips over into a decent J ruler too. But then you can also play machines with Loki. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Basically the same Judgment cost. Front side's relatively the same. But then you can play it with Hanzo too. Now you're going to say, well, how are you playing machines with Hanzo? I mean, he's a green ruler. He's green 2. He's got an Energize for green. Why are you playing this green ruler? This doesn't make any sense. Well, that's because of Sealing Scroll. Now, the way that runes work is that your master rune can only be used, as it says right here, if your J ruler is Hanzo or Hanzo Chief of the Koga. And that's Hanzo right here. And the reason this card is so good is because it's quick cast for 0, and it's a low cost divinity. And it just says, cancel target rune spell. Everyone's playing new Valhalla rulers. There's a lot of chants that are also runes in your main deck. So this card is going to see a lot of play. You have a cancel spell automatically in your rune deck that you can use at any time to stop a pivotal play. That's really good. And it doesn't really matter that he's green. And the reason I say that is because you can just play 10 blue stones and then never flip Hanzo, but you always have access to Sealing Scroll. It's a 0 cost. You don't need to pay anything for it. You don't need to have green will in order to play the thing. You can just flip it whenever you want. So that's good news. Now, of course, the runes you can't run are just regular runes that are in blue. Runes that are normal runes can only be used with the ruler that shares the same attribute as them. But if you have chant runes, that's a different story. And of course, we'll take a look at that in a few slides. But why is Sealing Scroll so good? Well, it stops things like Black Rosario. Now, this card is really good because we were seeing a lot of Lucifer, and it makes your opponent banish 2 resonators. So if you're on the receiving end of this card, it's only a 2 cost. For 2 will, they're getting rid of 2 of your resonators. And in machines, at least, if you have a bunch of +1/+1 counters on your machines, and Black Rosario hits, suddenly you've lost a lot of counters. You can't blow up your opponent's field, right? So you want to be able to stop that. Same thing goes for Odin's Judgment. Now it's a little bit more expensive in these different Brunhilde lists, but it says destroy all resonators. That's a pretty strong Wrath effect, right? You want to be able to stop that. But in addition to that, there are other chant runes that might be run in the main rune deck, or just in the regular main deck. Things like Blessing of the Sun, give something, give your board +2/+2, at the end of the turn recover all of your cards. That's pretty good. And this hits J resonators. This is a pretty powerful card. This is sort of like Sprint of the Beast Lady if you're old enough to remember that card. But this is just one example of some really powerful chant runes that are probably going to see play either in the rune deck or in the main deck. So this card is really good. Sealing Scroll has a lot of different targets it can hit. So, what are machines doing? Now, some people can look at all the cards, they can say, okay, so I understand where this deck is going, right? Well, let's look at this card first. Mechanized Knight. It's a 1-drop machine, it's a 5/5, that's pretty good stats for a 1-drop. Not bad. As long as there are no +1/+1 counters on this card, it doesn't recover. So that's not very good. But then you have things like Donut Drone, which give, 4 +1/+1 counters on 2 different resonators you control that are machines. That's pretty good, and it's also a 1-drop. In addition to that, you have another 1-drop. Mechanical Soldier. It's a 4/4. Doesn't have an effect, so it's not as good as some other 1-drops, but it's still relatively decent for what we're trying to do in this deck. Then you have Vivian, the Mechanical Fairy. Now this card is amazing because it has flying naturally, which is really, really good. And whenever another machine enters your field under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on that card. That's really, really important for this. So you can play Vivian. Because we don't have Severing Winds or other ways of canceling for free or for cheap right now, Vivian can reliably hit the field on, say, turns 3 or 4, and you can just start flooding the field with your Donut Drones and your Mechanical Soldiers and your Mechanized Knights and your other machines in order to get a ton of +1/+1 counters. And if you really want to, you can remove 2 +1/+1 counters from this card, and you can rest the target resonator. That's pretty good. It's a 3/3, but it gets bigger, and it gives your other machines +1/+1. And you can have multiples on the field, so that's really strong. But then, of course, you have one of the main win conditions of the deck, Lancelot, the Glass Knight. Now, Lancelot's a 3-drop, so the 6/6 tag here doesn't look that great. But don't forget, you have things like Donut Drone, Vivian, and some other support that are going to make him bigger as soon as he enters the field. And of course, his own effect, when he comes in, he gets a +1/+1 counter, and he puts those on each machine resonator that you control. That's including himself. So if you have, say, 3 resonators that are all machines, and you drop Lancelot, you're getting 4 +1/+1 counters distributed among those resonators. That's pretty good. If one of them is Vivian, you're getting another one on top of that. So Lancelot, in addition to Vivian, will be giving you 5 +1/+1 counters. That's really, really good. And you can remove 3 of those counters to destroy target resonator. Or if you have 10 total, you can remove all of those to make it so your opponent's J/resonators lose all their abilities at the end of the turn, and then you destroy all resonators your opponent controls. That is huge. That is really, really, really good. Lancelot is probably the one card, when people saw this, they were very, very, very hyped for machines, which is saying a lot, because blue, in the history of Force of Will anyway, blue has not been very strong, but lately that's been changing. So what else do machines have? Because 5 cards don't make a deck, right? You have 1 cancel rune, that's cute. You have these 5 machine resonators, pretty strong, but they're only 5 cards, right? So what else do you have? Well, you have things like the Knight's Castle in the Sky, Sky Round. Now it's a machine, but it's not a resonator, so it cannot gain +1/+1 counters. That just wouldn't make any sense. Because like, what are you going to attack with this giant donut in the sky? It just doesn't make any sense. But it says machines you control gain +1/+1, and that's a field effect. So they're not gaining counters from that first effect, but they are gaining counters when they enter the field. So if you have a machine that enters the field under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on that resonator. That's really good. It's a decent card. You maybe run 2 or 3 copies of it in your deck. Well, they also have things like Erendite, the Nitrogen Blade, and it's just a 1-cost, quick cast, cancel target automatic ability. Those are like trigger effects. If you come from Yu-Gi-Oh! Or enter the battlefield effects in most card games would be considered trigger automatic abilities in this card game. And if this card was awakened, you can destroy that resonator. So an awakening of blue 2, that's pretty good. Later in the game, you're going to want to get rid of your opponent's resonators because they might be a little bit more potent, things like Belial. If you don't know what that is, you'll see very soon. Erendite is a very good card. It's very strong. Canceling automatic abilities in blue is nothing new. This is stuff that we've seen in things like Kiza's Call, for instance. Kiza's Call is a very good card because it stops an automatic ability and draws you a card. This is very similar to that. Then you have things like Skyround Technician. Now it's a 2-drop machine, but when it enters, you put a +1/+1 counter on another machine that you control. So you can't give it to itself, but it's a 6/6. That's relatively on curve for most 2-drops. That's pretty good. Then you have things like Gawain. Now Gawain can put out a lot of damage because it's an 8/8 for 3, and if you have a +1/+1 counter on it, which you should if you have Skyround in the field, then it gains Swiftness. So that's a nice little combo. It's a 9/9 with Swiftness at that point, and that's pretty strong. That's a big hit. Then of course you have Mechanical Bishop. Enters our automatic abilities. If there's still any confusion about what those might be, enter effects are an example of automatic abilities. So it enters and it triggers. Target machine resonator you control gains at end of turn, recover this card. So it's just a way of preventing your opponent from attacking, and it's a way of getting more +1/+1 counters on the field by putting a machine in the field under Skyround. Then you have the new Percival card. It's got quick cast, so you can play it on your opponent's turn. It's a 4-drop, it's a 9/9. It can get bigger because of +1/+1 counters because it's a machine. And if you enter and you decide to do the effect, you can return another machine resonator you control to your hand, and then you can bounce another target resonator your opponent controls. So it's not necessarily removal, but it does push your opponent back in terms of their tempo. So that's relatively fine. Some players are playing this in the main deck, a couple copies here, and then a couple copies in the side. And then other players are just siding like 3 or 4 of these entirely and just not even putting it into the main deck. It's more of a mid-range card, but it's still useful nonetheless. And then you have cards like Merlin, the control unit of Skyround. Now, the thing that's really interesting about Merlin is if you pay X for the Awakening, you can search out Skyround because it's still a machine. It's not a resonator, but it's a machine. And Merlin says search for a machine out of your deck. Total cost X plus 2. Skyround is a 2 cost, so you can pay 0 and grab it. It's pretty great. And of course you shuffle your deck. Skyround's really good for that. But in addition to that, you can search things out like your Vivian by just paying 0. That's really good. You can play a couple copies of Merlin in your deck, and suddenly you have access to all of these really small resonators. Pretty good for a 4-drop in my opinion. So what else can Hanzo use? Well, they can use things like Scrap and Build in their Rune deck, which is really good. You can pay 2 less if it's in the Rune deck, so that's great. You can also put it in your main deck if you want to. Some players were actually siding this card, opting for just for more room. You can remove X machines in your graveyard from the game. Then you look at the top X cards of your deck, put a machine with total cost X or less from among them into the field, and you put the rest on the bottom of your deck in any order. I'm sorry, that's random order. Excuse me, I can read, I promise. Scrap and Build's pretty good. Lets you search through your deck, Cards are in your graveyard anyway. There's no way of really bringing them back, so you don't really worry about removing them from the grave. It's no big deal. Then you have Massive Growth. So you can pay 1 less if it's in a rune deck, which is good. And then you can produce 3 blue will. So that can work really well with things like Merlin or other cards that have Awakening. Probably mostly with Merlin or Erendite. That's also really good. Then you have things like Invitation, which is just search your deck for a card and put it into your hand and then shuffle your deck. And because you're searching for a card, you don't have to reveal it because your opponent can see that it's a card and that it was in your deck. So you don't have to show them. If it said Resonator, you would have to confirm that it's a Resonator. If it was said Chant, you would have to confirm that it was a Chant by revealing it to your opponent. But it's a card. That's what makes this card so good. And then of course you can play Sealing Scroll and maybe like one other rune. And you're going to say, well, why is it then that you get to play those blue runes in your deck? I thought you said that blue runes can only be used if you had a blue ruler. Well, that's almost what I said. So Chant runes can go in your rune deck even if your ruler is not a blue ruler. If your ruler does not match the color of the attribute of your Chant runes. And that's important to remember because that's what gives the rune deck such flexibility, especially going forward. Now what about if you want to play Arthur? Well, Arthur has his own Master Rune, but he also gets access to Maintenance, which is probably a little bit more important. So this says put 2 +1/+1 counters on up to 2 target machine resonators. That's 4 +1/+1 counters. That's really good. And now we'll talk about the Master Rune. Now the Master Rune is not necessarily a board wipe. It's fine. It's pretty good. I personally really like this card for other reasons. Just the idea of Excalibur being a giant cannon that can destroy things. I like the flavor a lot. And it can also make your opponent think in very interesting ways because you have to put everything on their field into 2 separate piles and then you get to choose which cards go back to the top of the deck and shuffled. I'm sorry, on the bottom of the deck. Put in any order that you want. That's pretty good. A lot of people decided that's not as good as the Sealing Scroll, but it's still good. You also have things like Petrification. Because it's a rune and it's blue, you can use it with Arthur. It's just a way of locking your opponent's field down. It's just one example of many blue runes that you can use. Well, what about Loki? Why would you want to run Loki? Well, Loki works with Merlin. Now, on Loki's flip side, you can pay 2 less for the awakening costs of any spells you control. Spells include both Resonators and Chants. Those are all spells. Now that's pretty cool because then you can suddenly pay just 2 will using Loki's effect on the awakening cost for Merlin, and suddenly you can search your whole deck for any machine you want. Now that's pretty cool. The flip side is that you get an 8/12 J ruler that just pays for awakening cost. It doesn't really do anything else. It's not a beater. It doesn't do any other cool effects. It doesn't reset your runes. It doesn't do anything like that. It's just you get to pay awakening costs a little bit more cheaply. It's fine. It's okay. Now here are a couple of the lists that we saw at the GP. A lot of them look the same. Of course, you might see in Jordan Tan's list, there are a couple mostly blue stones, and then a couple of the green stones to be able to flip Hanzo. That's the only real downside to Hanzo. He's green, so you can't really flip him with blue stones. It's not really how the game works. And of course, if you're having trouble seeing any of these cards, head down to the description. All the gacha logs for lists at this tournament are going to be provided in order from 1st to 8th place. And you can check out any of these lists that you want down there and check out the cards through the gacha log system. So definitely check those out if you can. So what else was at the tournament at Worlds? Well, there was Brunhilde. Now Brunhilde is one of those rulers that you see and you're just like, wow, okay, so this card is pretty good because it has natural flying. It's a 12/12, so that's some pretty staggering stats. You're probably never not going to be blocked. I think I said that strange, so I'm going to say it one more time. You're always going to get in 12 damage. But her enter effect is the thing that people saw and went kind of nuts over. Put target resonator from your graveyard into the field, and that's any resonator. anything from graveyard into the field, so you get a 12/12 flyer and then something. Make it count. Now, the thing that's interesting about these lists is that they're not necessarily all white lists. The only white cards that we saw in these lists were things like Belthor. It's got a 5/5 stat line for 2, has flying. When it gets put into the graveyard from the field, you draw a card. Nothing to go crazy about. Pretty standard. Then we saw things like Air Valkyrie of Mercy. Enter, put target resonator with total cost 2 or less from your graveyard into the field, so it just recurs something small. You might be able to get back Bethor. It's fine. It's okay. And then you have Spear of the Valkyries, and this card is actually pretty good. You don't want to put it in your rune deck because you have to pay 2 more to play it from there. It's not really worth it to do that. There are other better runes that you can put in your rune deck. But when you play this card deals damage equal to the highest attack among J Resonators you control to target J Resonator. Doesn't say your opponent controls, it says target J Resonators. You can hit your own stuff if you want to. That might be relevant, probably never will be. You almost always want to hit your opponent's stuff. But if you control a Valkyrie, and spoilers, Brunhilde is a Valkyrie, it's in the field, so it counts, you gain that much life. So that's pretty great. So you're going to be dealing a ton of damage to your opponent's stuff, and you're going to be gaining life as a result of that. If you're playing the game, you're probably going to want to be trying to kill them, kill their Resonator with whatever you're playing, whenever you're playing this card. That's pretty relevant. Pretty good white card. Well, then you have stuff like Protection of the Angels. Play this card during your opponent's turn. Something gets +8/+8 and barrier until the end of the turn, and it can't be chased. Not a bad card at all, especially for a 1-drop chant. That's pretty darn good. And that's where everything in at least the white category ends. Because then you start playing things like Shem Hazah, the Fallen Angel of Sadism. It's a 10/10 with flying. It's a 4-drop. It's pretty good. This is probably something you would want to bring back with Brunhilde. It's very good because especially when it enters, your opponent discards a card. Resources are good in the game. Not a bad card to bring back. As long as your opponent has 2 or less cards in their hand, the card gets +4/+4. So suddenly it's a 14/14 with flying. Probably can't block that. Probably can't block 2 flyers. A 12/12 and a 14/14. That's pretty hard to do. And then you have things like Patchwork Frankenstein. A 10/10 for 2. That's not bad. Whenever this card attacks or blocks, it doesn't recover during your next recovery phase. So it's a little weird, but it's still a 10/10. That's still relevant. And then you have things like Belial. So if your life is 10 or less, you can pay 3 mana less to play this card. 3 will less. And it's also a 12/12 with flying. That's pretty good. And when it enters, you destroy all non-Fallen Angel Resonators, which is a lot of stuff. And whenever a Resonator is put into a graveyard from the field, this card deals 10 damage to your opponent. That's your own stuff. You can send your own stuff to the graveyard and deal damage to your opponent. Belial is kind of a bomb. It's pretty good. So what about chance? Because Brunhilde can't just run Resonators. That's just not how the game works. You want to use as many of the chants you have available as you possibly can. And she's already in black, so what black chance is she going to run? Well, Look of Corruption is a really good card. It's thought control, but you can awaken it, and suddenly you get to get rid of 2 of their cards. In a control list like Brunhilde, that's pretty good. In addition to that, you have Life Severing Blade. There's kind of a meme going around about this card about how severing cards themselves always have this reduction effect attached to them. It's pretty funny, pretty hilarious. And if a Resonator you control is put into the graveyard from the field, you get that reduction effect. And suddenly you have a 1-drop kill anything. That's pretty good. Anything except J Rulers, I guess you could say. In addition to that, Reign of Tears. You can pay 1 more to play this card from your rune area, so you're probably going to play it in your main deck. You can put 3 -1/-1 counters on target Resonators. That's pretty good. So the way this works is that these counters replace +1/+1 counters. So this card is really good anti-machine sort of support. It's a really good way of getting rid of your opponent's +1/+1 counters. So you want to play maybe 4 of these. Plus they get smaller, so you get rid of their buff, but then you make their opponent's resonators even smaller because you got rid of their counters. That's pretty darn good. So what about the rune deck? Well, Brunhilde's Wrath, destroy Resid J Resonator. That's really good. Destroy, if your opponent's also playing a Brunhilde, or they're playing a Lucifer, or they're playing Arthur or Loki, and they happen to tap down for a stone, happen to attack you, you can just destroy them. Of course, it's not quick cast, so you might still be taking the damage, or you might be able to chump block to prevent that damage, but then they lose their J Resonator. That's pretty good. Then you also have Karmic Reversal. If damage would be dealt to target J Resonator you control, it's dealt to your opponent instead. That's pretty funny. That can steal games. I like this so far. Of course, those are 2 Divinity 3 runes. Pretty decent effects for 3 Divinity, I think. Then you have things like Dispel. So if your opponent's playing stuff like Sky Round or Rain Ruins, you can just get rid of it. Or if you feel like, you're kind of falling behind on life, you can just gain 10 life. That's pretty good too. That's all for 1. Of course, you can also play Whispers of the Angel. 2 less from this from your rune area. Gain 8 life, draw a card, it's fine. It's not something you're gonna ever want to main deck, because why would you want to pay 3 to draw a card? That seems really, really bad. So just put it in your rune deck instead. It's a Divinity 2, it's fine. It's totally okay. But then of course you have Odin's Judgment, which we covered before. Destroy all resonators if your J Ruler is Brunhilde. It's pretty darn good, especially for a Divinity 2. And so many of these lists decided that they were going to go in the direction of a black Reanimator style Brunhilde list, and I think that's a really interesting way of looking at this. It's something I honestly did not think about when I saw this ruler. Mostly because when I think of deck building, I think of New Frontiers stuff, and decks like this are just going to get torn apart by Evil Elemental Uprising and other ways of getting rid of your opponent's graveyard. Viola Treacherous Maiden is another card that I think about when I think about Reanimator targets removing stuff from the graveyard. So maybe Brunhilde is going to be less Reanimator, and it might look more White Rush in the coming format in New Frontiers, maybe. But still, this is an interesting deck to see. There's a lot of really strong black resonators that get resurrected through Brunhilde's enter effect when she flips, and that's really, really good. The other ruler we should talk about today is Lucifer. Now, Lucifer is an interesting J ruler because the judgment is very high. And when you flip, you get rid of 3 of your opponent's cards. That's really why you're flipping. It's also nice to have 8/8 damage flying in the air. That's pretty good, but it kind of pales in comparison to Brunhilde. So Brunhilde can block this. Other flying resonators can block this, but there's not very many of those at the moment. So it's still relatively decent, but it's not why you're flipping. You're flipping to get rid of the cards. So what resonators is Lucifer looking to run? Well, Azazel is really good, and you might have seen Azazel in the previous Brunhilde list. Azazel is amazing. It's a 9/10 for 4, but you can pay 2 less to pay the card if your opponent has 1 or less cards in their hand. So if you get rid of their hand, you can just play this card for 2. And a 2-drop 9/10 with flying, that's ridiculous. Absolutely insane. But it's not over, because when it enters, you can choose one, look at the top 2 cards of your deck, you can put a card from among them into your hand, and the rest in your graveyard. Or you can target 2 resonators your opponent controls, and your opponent banishes one of them. So it's essentially a searching effect, a scry effect, or I guess we're calling that a foresee effect in this game. Or it's a removal spell, a kind of removal spell. Either way, you're getting a +1 when it enters the field. In addition to it being a 9/10 for 2, I can't tell you how amazing this card is. It's really, really solid. And it's only a rare too, so just keep that in mind. It's a solid card and it's a rare. Well, what other resonators do we have? We have Minister of Grief, enter resonators your opponent controls, getting -5/-5. And for you, that might not seem very good for a 4-drop, but then you have things like Rain of Tears. So if your opponent has -3/-3 counters, then -5/-5 might kill it. That's pretty darn good. Then you also have things like Jet Black Wings in the Rune deck, and I'm kind of giving you a sneak peek with this one, but -6/-6 to your opponent's Resonators. That's pretty darn good too. All for 3, so you have the potential to board wipe. It's not a hard destruction, but it's stuff that builds up over time. So Minister of Grief is relatively okay. It's a 5/5, so it might get in some damage, but it's mostly being used for its effect. Then of course you have Belial to come in and destroy all non-fallen angel resonators that are on the field and deal a bunch of damage to your opponent. It's pretty good. Gets cheaper if your life is a little bit lower. You want this in this deck. It's really solid. Our friend Shamhazah, that's still a pretty good card. It's a fallen angel, won't get destroyed by Belial. It's discarding effects. That's really good. So all of these cards are pretty solid, and they're all in the vein of being a control list. That's pretty darn good. In terms of chance, you also still have Look of Corruption. You still have Life Severing Blade. Still have Rain of Tears. And then you have Whispers of the Devil. Just allows you to draw 2 cards, lose 500 life. Not that really big of a deal unless you're going against something that's a little bit more aggressive. Generally speaking though, it's okay, because you're going to be drawing 2 cards. In a control list, you want more cards than your opponent. That's just really good. So then what is in Lucifer's Rune deck? Because Lucifer gets a few additional resources compared to other black Reanimator / control / discard rulers. Well, it gets Tears of the Fallen. Now, Tears of the Fallen caused a huge uproar when it was first released because people said, well, it's a 0 cost. I can just jam it into any rune deck that I want. But of course, because it's a rune, it has to go in the same attribute color as the ruler that it's in. So only Lich and Lucifer could use this card. Still really good. Your opponent discards a card at random. That's okay. It's fine. Mostly, you just want to get cards out of your opponent's hand so that, you know, Lucifer's support can actually start doing stuff. That's why you want to run this card. 0 cost, you can flip it beginning of the game, get rid of an opponent's card. You can flip it later in the game, make your opponent's random discard hurt a little bit more. Depends on when you want to run this card. Might get in that one last card that you need in order to get off some really good effect. Just depends. Then you can play Jet Black Wings, which is something we've already seen before. Demon Division, which, you know, for those Magic players might look like Demonic Tutor. Basically the same thing. Search your deck for a card, put it into your hand, shuffle your deck. You don't have to reveal it to your opponent because it's just a card. Then you have things like Scythe of the Reaper, which are really decent. Destroy a target resonator, total cost 3 or less. It's fine. It's it's basically what old school players would call a Stoning to Death, although it's a little bit more restrictive. Stoning to Death was kill anything you want for 2 mana. Scythe of the Reaper is kill anything 3 or less for 2 mana. It's not bad. Then you have things like Sandstorm, which was in Federico Zappini's list. You can pay a red less to play this card from your rune area, so you can just splash into whenever you want. It's a chant rune, so it doesn't have to match the attribute of the ruler. That's just fine. It's just something you can tech in. Deal 200 damage to each resonator your opponent controls. Might get some stuff off the field, especially if he has some additional negs on the field, like things from Rain Ruins or Tears of the Fallen, Jet Black Wings. It's really good for just getting in that extra 200. It's not too bad. Then of course you have things like Black Rosario you can play too. Now we've already talked about this card a lot, so I'm not going to go over it here, but it's just another really good way of getting rid of your opponent's stuff. It's not bad. And then of course here are a few of the lists that we're seeing that were being played at the Worlds in the top 8. They're all pretty standard. Playing the Skeleton Horde as a way of getting additional tokens and stuff like that. And they're all these different, most of them are the basics of what we just covered, but there are also some specific cards that I didn't mention. So that way, go down to the description, check out these lists if you want. These are all really good lists to look at, especially if you want to start playing in New Frontiers if you're new to the game. And there's your top 8. So we got Javier Herrera's, who got first place. Congratulations to them. They are the world champion for 2018. That's a pretty big deal, guys, just saying. And then, of course, Jordan Tan, Naoyuki Yada, excuse me for mispronouncing your name so horribly, Federico Zappini, Charlie DeMule, Kevin Carrara, Soichi Ito, and Philip Kaibiors. All these are your top 8 players for the start of the new Valhalla Cluster. So Let us know what you thought down in the comments below. I'm going to try and make these videos a little bit faster, especially going into the future. I think that what we're going to see is we're going to see some new Valhalla rulers going forward, but I wanted to make sure that you understood how these decks work. So if you see them at your locals, you see them at your regionals, you see them at the GP, if you see them wherever you want to play Force of Will, you know what you're up against. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Ring that bell, please, because that would really be great if we could just show up in your inbox to give you more Force of Will content. And of course, as always, deck lists are down in the description. This has been Paul Reissmann.